Welcome back to the Halloween edition of my Story Explained series, where I break down video game stories into a digestible format. I mentioned in the last video that I will work on a sequel to The Suffering next, but since it's Halloween, I wanted to embrace the spirit of the season. So in this episode, I'm going to be sharing a story of my Halloween comfort game and one of PlayStation's most overlooked series, MediEvil. The original game was developed by Sony Computer Entertainment Cambridge and released in 1998, while the 2019 remake was developed by Other Ocean Emeryville and is the version I'll be playing for this video, since it features updated visuals and gameplay, and it just looks more visually appealing, although the story remains largely unchanged from the original. This is an action game with a sense of humor and heavy Halloween vibes, which is fitting since the original creator said they took inspiration from Nightmare Before Christmas, one of the goats of claymation, in my opinion. And because of that, I absolutely love it, and it was even so good that it received 2 different remakes. It's a tale of perseverance and redemption, and what it looks like to become a hero. In this game, we step into the role of Sir Daniel Fortesque, a knight who's been dead 100 years, and who was accidentally resurrected by an evil sorcerer Zarok, who legendary tales claim Daniel had slain. However, the truth and the legend are hardly the same. So sit back, relax, and let's dive bones first into the gothic world of Gallowmere in MediEvil.
In a time long ago, there lived in the kingdom of Gallowmere a sorcerer named Zarok. This arrogant, pitiless man hated his fellow citizens for their simple and peaceful ways. So he raised an army of demons and set out to take the realm for his own. The king's champion, Sir Daniel Fortesque, led the militia in the battle against this unholy horde. Songs are still sung of how he spearheaded the charge deep into the accursed multitude, how demons fell before him like wheat before the scythe, and how at last, though mortally wounded, he destroyed the sorcerer utterly. Fortesque went down in history that day as the hero of Gallowmere, and a time of peace began, which was to last for 100 years. And then the sorcerer returned.
And with the return of Zarok begins the start of the game, so let's quickly discuss Daniel's backstory first. Back in the year 1286, before the Great Battle, he was just a man living comfortably. As the son of a well-known wealthy nobleman, he received respect he didn't truly earn, which meant he never learned what it takes to be a real knight. He was lazy and arrogant, only deciding to become a knight to win the attention of the local women. Ironically, he was quite talented in fighting, but his laziness often squandered whatever potential he had. Being a privileged nepo baby allowed Daniel to rise through the ranks of the military quickly. Famine had run rampant across the lands, and King Peregrin was tasked with finding a solution, until a sorcerer named Zarok arrived. Zarok claimed to have magical abilities to restore crops and bring peace, so Peregrin appointed him as the second in command, unaware of the troubles that would follow. Gradually, Peregrin's behavior changed. He became overwhelmed with a mental fog and began entrusting his tasks to Zarok. It was later revealed that Zarok was responsible for the king's fogginess. Even worse, he had cast a spell on the land itself, causing it to wither and die, so he could swoop in as its savior and claim the throne. Hearing of Daniel's incompetence, Zarok used his magic to coerce the king into appointing him as his new captain of the army. Shortly afterwards, the brand new Captain Fortesque was warned by the king that a horde of 5,000 undead soldiers was advancing on Gallowmere. And at this point, we know how the story ends. With misplaced confidence, Sir Daniel Fortesque led the king's army into battle. He delivered a hyped speech promising clean underwear for everyone upon their success. Ill. However, unlike the legendary stories that have been told, when the first volley of Zarok's arrows were released, Daniel was the very first casualty. Despite this, the king's army ultimately emerged victorious. And to save face, King Peregrin crafted the story that portrayed Sir Daniel Fortesque as a courageous hero who died nobly in battle, claiming that he had slain Zarok, but that too was a lie. You see, after the battle, Zarok's body was never actually recovered and was presumed dead until his reappearance, while Sir Daniel's body was memorialized as the hero of Gallowmere, his body placed in a hero's tomb while history went on to chronicle the tales of his supposed sacrifice. Zarok, having prepared in the shadows, began his new plan of attack. When he escaped, he obtained a book of dark magic, capable of many devious and taboo spells, and a curious tool known as the Shadow Artifact. which served as a key to a tomb that held back otherworldly entities called shadow demons. These demons have aided Zarok in constructing his castle back in 1286 before their imprisonment. However, Zarok's initial plan was thwarted by the mayor of a place called Gallowstown, who had stolen the shadow artifact from him and hidden it away in a safe that could only be opened with a key created with the technique of a blacksmith called Willie Green. Fast forward exactly 100 years to 1386, and Daniel awakens due to Zarok's reanimation and encounters a gargoyle that teases him about the truth of his death and that the second chance at life should be used to seek revenge on Zarok. Literally armed and with newfound determination, Daniel leaves his crypt and ventures into Fortesque Cemetery, battling the undead servants of Zarok. As he gets his bearings on combat, he notices a magical green trail, which for us marks the end of a level, but for him means a path to the sinister sorcerer. Before Daniel leaves, if he collects enough souls from defeated enemies, he can find a golden chalice and open the doors to a place called the Hall of Heroes, where many of the legendary heroes of the land are housed, awaiting someone who can collect all the chalices and restore their statues to their rightful glory. In the hall, the gargoyle shows up to scold him since it believes Daniel is a failure, and sadly, it seems that even he felt like he didn't belong there. This realization ultimately motivated Sir Daniel in his mission to take down Zarok and earn his place among the heroes. With the chalice in hand, we meet the first hero and someone of some importance to Daniel in the past, Canny Tim. In the original game, Tim was a crossbowman who was Daniel's second in command, but for the remake, they were expanded upon in a comic titled Fate's Arrow and was released by the original creator of the old game, Chris Sorrell. In this story, Tim helps Daniel relive some past moments that involve some time shenanigans, and with the help of some fairies, they spur the events of the Great Battle into occurring. However, it's revealed that Tim is actually a woman, and her identity was hidden since she wouldn't have been allowed in the military otherwise. Now, if she wasn't badass enough, Tim fought alongside us during the Great Battle, and when we fell, she avenged us by sniping Zarok's horse-riding champion, Lord Cardok, in the eye with an arrow, killing him before eventually suffering the same fate as Daniel. She gives Daniel a crossbow, the very weapon she used to kill Lord Cardok, and Daniel heads to Cemetery Hill. Upon arriving, two chunky boulder-shooting gargoyles try to stop him by bombarding the hills with the rocks. So he makes a detour, and while exploring, discovers one of the witch's old talismans that can be used to summon one of the two remaining witches left in Gallowmere. He made his way to the top of the hill and entered the Hilltop Mausoleum, which was inhabited by small creatures known as imps. These annoying little shits can steal your weapons and force you to spend the little gold that you've earned up until this point to get it back. They also happen to steal the sheet music from an organ-playing phantom who practiced in the mausoleum. After helping it get the music, we find a glass heart that we're warned is keeping a stained glass demon frozen, and therefore not a threat. So of course we release it, and for good reason too, because this is one of the coolest looking bosses in the game, and probably the most memorable for a lot of people who played it. The battle begins, but Dan emerges victorious, defeating the demon and obtaining a key shaped like a skull that can be used to open up a giant gate back in Fortesque Cemetery. With the key in hand, Dan returns to the large gate and passes through it, entering an area known as Scarecrow Fields. As soon as he steps into the new territory, he's attacked by insanely strong scarecrows infused with Zarok's steroid magic. These scarecrows are aggressive, fast, and can easily take a chunk out of your life if you get too close. So Dan had to navigate carefully to avoid their ambushes and assaults. In addition to the scarecrows, he encountered hostile foes such as mad farmers hiding in haystacks, imps operating giant mech armor designed to steal crops. Those motherfuckers just can't stop stealing. And enemies called corn killers, which you can barely see and will instant kill you if you step into the cornfield. Passing through the gauntlet, Dan finds a weird occurrence. Imprisoned inside a chest was a ghost-like serpent called Kul Katura. King Peregrin's men had imprisoned this friendly serpent, mistakenly believing that it was the evil serpent of Gallowmere, which turns out to be the brother of this apparition. With its help, Daniel navigated through the cornfield, overcoming many traps until he reaches his next destination, a place called Pumpkin Gorge. There, he faced reanimated pumpkins, which had been created as a byproduct of Zarok's magic corrupting the land. These evil veggies attacked Dan as he continued to battle until he stumbled upon an old witch's cauldron, which reminded him of the talisman he carried, and after using it, summoned the first of two witches left in the land, the Pumpkin Witch. The Pumpkin Witch explained that she was like a mother to the pumpkins, and shared that they had apparently once been good-natured and friendly, before falling under the influence of the evil Pumpkin King, a creation of Zarok. It's not really clear if in the regular state of the world the flora have consciousness, or if it's just specific to the gorge, but I found that pretty interesting. She asked for Dan's help to stop the Pumpkin King, so true to his word, Dan pulverizes it into a pile of goo. Upon returning to the witch, Dan was rewarded with an item known as the Dragon Gem, though its purpose remained a mystery to him for now. From there, Dan journeyed into the Sleeping Village, aka Gallowstown, which you might recall was where Zarok mind-controlled the villagers upon his return and where the important shadow artifact resides. Unsurprisingly, the possessed townspeople turn hostile to Dan, so we have no other choice but to put them out of their misery. While in the village, Dan discovers a small church that was missing its crucifix. A note from the mayor indicated that he had taken the crucifix as it was a key to a key, so we scrounge around the town for items that we can use to recreate the crucifix, conveniently finding a golden bust of Mr. Shanks, who was a landlord of a bar called the Troll's Head, as well as a cast for a crucifix. Once the items are collected, the town is stormed by Zarok's machine guards, so quickly, Dan took both the bust and the metal to the blacksmith's forge. And right next to it were the exact instructions left by Willie Green on how to create the crucifix, which makes no sense as to why the robots couldn't figure that out themselves, but whatever. Returning the newly forged crucifix to the church's walls reveal a secret lever that opens a gate near the town's lake. This passage leads behind the mayor's house and, hopping through the chimney, Dan finds a safe. And inside that safe was the shadow artifact, the key to the tomb of the shadow demons and what the guards were searching for. Just as he's about to leave, Dan discovers a note from Zarok instructing his men to capture the mayor and take him to the dungeons of the asylum. Determined to help, Dan sets his sights on the asylum. Upon arriving outside the asylum grounds, he encounters Jack of the Green, a half-stone, half-bush talking head who loved to speak in riddles. The grounds of the asylum were under Jack's control, so Dan had to solve the riddles if he wanted to progress. He easily solved the first riddle and continued through the second, third, and fourth. By this point, Jack was quite annoyed and rushed us to get out of the grounds, so we oblige and finally arrive at the asylum. The level is fast-paced, consisting of several rooms where we participate in a minigame reminiscent of Smash TV, where our only goal is to survive. At the end, we encounter the mayor, who looks nothing like I expected, which seems to be a reoccurring theme in this game. He informs us that, just like in the note, Zarok intended to steal back the shadow artifact to use on the tomb. The mayor reveals that the tomb is located beneath a place called the Enchanted Earth. With this information, Daniel decides to follow the lead and allows the mayor to enjoy his freedom. Dan ventures deeper into the forest and encounters an archway that blocks his path. Soon after, he discovers the tomb that he's been searching for. Using the shadow artifact, Dan opens the door and finds a note instructing him to take the shadow talisman. Without it, he can't pass through the territory of the shadow demons. But there's a problem. To obtain the talisman, he must release the demons. After stepping on some elemental stones, he frees the shadow demons and receives the talisman. As he exits the tomb, a nearby gargoyle chastises him for dooming them all, but informs Dan that the shadow demons will head for King Peregrin's castle. Naturally, Dan's next destination is there. Returning to the earlier archway, Dan uses the shadow talisman, allowing him entry. However, his journey is fraught with danger, as he battles a pair of demon sisters known as the Demonettes. After defeating them, he encounters more shadow demons in the area, and eventually makes it out of the enchanted forest. To reach the castle, Dan must traverse the pools of the ancient dead, the site of the Battle of Gallowmere, where he lost his life. Upon arrival, he meets an old friend, the ferryman, who's actually Death. The ferryman explains that he can take Dan to his destination, but first, Dan must collect 8 souls from the battlefield. After completing this task, Dan battles the remains of fallen soldiers from the king's army as they journey through the pools. After returning to the ferryman, Dan is taken to a location known as the Lake, which is actually Mellowmead, once a thriving town, but's now a sunken ruin, destroyed by creatures known as Rhinotaurs. The Rhinotaurs, residing in a cave system known as the Crystal Caves, retaliated after miners from Mellowmead conducted a disastrous expedition, resulting in the town's destruction. The area is now inhabited by hostile fish and watchful spies on the walls, which summon entities known as the Guardians of Mellowmead if you're caught. These Guardians perform ritualistic sacrifices to some elder deity, though it's easy to guess who that might be. Yeah, the Lovecraft inspiration is high with this one. Eventually, Dan discovers a massive whirlpool. After navigating through it, he acquires what he needs to escape the sunken town of Mellowmead. His journey then leads him to the Crystal Caves. Inside the caves, Dan learns that the Rhinotaurs are hibernating within crystals that prolong their life. He battles shadow demons, bats, Rhinotaurs, and imps as he progresses. Eventually, he reaches a large area and discovers the use for the 2 dragon gems that he's found before. He places them into the dragon statue, awaking an actual dragon. However, the dragon is terrified of being crushed by fallen debris, and Dan exploits this by hitting the ground with his hammer, which causes debris to fall on the dragon's head. Confused and somewhat embarrassed, The dragon has had enough and grants Dan a potion that will adorn him with dragon armor. This armor gives Dan resistance to fire damage and the ability to breathe fire. In exchange, Dan agrees to leave the dragon alone and he departs the cave. Dan heads to an area known as Gallows Gauntlet, filled with danger and inhabited by the undead remnants of executed criminals. It's also the home of the real evil serpent of Gallowmere, which was supposed to be captured by King Peregrin's men. Using his new dragon armor, Dan passes through the archway, a gate of fire that would otherwise have incinerated him. Within this new area, Dan confronts the evil serpent of Gallowmere and frees the souls trapped there. After navigating through the Gallows Gauntlet, he leaves this cursed area and progresses to what was known once as King Peregrin's castle, but is now known as the Haunted Ruins. Since Dan released the shadow demons, they have occupied the ruin and taken some farmers hostage, threatening to burn them alive. Dan fights through the ruins, defeating the shadow demons and freeing the farmers. He then enters the former throne of King Peregrin, where he discovers the king's crown. With the crown in hand, Dan can summon the ghost of King Peregrin, who reveals that the shadow demons are hiding beneath the castle, in the mountain, preparing for their invasion of Gallowmere. The castle was built atop a once active but now dormant volcano, which is kept dormant by a floodgate that contains the lava. The plan is to collapse the castle on the shadow demons, thwarting Zarok's second invasion attempt. King Peregrin then transports Dan to an area with a lever, guarded by 2 stone golems. Dan swiftly defeats them and activates the lever, opening the floodgates. He then makes a mad dash to escape, launching himself from a catapult over the castle walls. Dan lands in a wooded area, soon encounters a Jabberwocky, a mythical chicken-dragon hybrid that wants some bone broth for dinner. The Fates Arrow comic actually shows us how in the past, Daniel sort of fought one of these creatures before, so at least he has some experience in how dangerous they can be. While being chased, he finds himself trapped at the edge of a high cliff, when he is unexpectedly saved by a massive vulture that swoops down and lifts him into the sky, while the Jabberwocky falls off the cliff. High in the sky, the vulture drops Dan onto a ghost ship filled with the skeletal remains of the former pirate crew. Mistaking him for a threat, the crew, led by a hostile captain, sets out to kill Dan. Although little is revealed about what happened to the ship and its crew, Dan navigates the nightmarish obstacle course created by the crew as he makes his way to confront the captain. Using a couple of nearby cannons, Dan defeats the captain and commandeers the ship. It turns out that the ghost ship is quite useful, as Zarok's lair is located atop a very tall mountain. Upon arriving at the entrance hall of Zarok's castle, Dan is greeted by a gargoyle, who informs him that Zarok is not there, as he's busy. The entrance is also guarded by numerous imps, which Dan swiftly defeats. Afterward, Dan discovers Zarok's library, filled with books on spells and necromancy. As he exits the entrance hall, he stumbles upon a mysterious time device, falls into it, and ends up in the heart of a mountain. The area is patrolled by boiler guards who try to stop him, but they fail. Dan skillfully avoids hazards and uses various time contraptions to open multiple gates, ultimately leading him to a train that will take him directly to Zarok's lair, and hopefully, this time, to Zarok himself. Upon arriving at Zarok's lair, Dan encounters another gargoyle that mentions a chalice. He needs to collect the souls stolen by Zarok and return them to the Hall of Heroes. This is the game's way of letting you know if you collect all of the chalices, you get a secret ending. Once in the lair, Dan places his chalice upon the shield inside the arena. Zarok finally appears and summons his skeletal guards to surround Dan. This is where the chalice comes into play. It summons 8 of Dan's own guards, leading to a battle between the two sides. Dan runs around using his chalice powers to restore the health of his fellow soldiers and eventually defeats Zarok's guards. However, Zarok has a trick up his sleeve. He calls upon Lord Cardok, who was previously killed in battle by Canny Tim. Cardok rides in on a skeletal horse, but he proves to be no match for Dan, who quickly overcomes him. Frustrated, Zarok decides to confront Dan directly. He retreats to his laboratory and transforms himself into some sort of monstrosity. After a long and challenging battle, Dan manages to best Zarok. Not willing to let Dan escape so easily, Zarok attempts to bring the cave crashing down around them. However, the plan backfires, and a massive piece of rock crushes Zarok, giving Dan an opening to flee towards an exit. The time device then explodes, propelling Dan forward until he finds safety on a flying cog from the machine. He jumps off onto a hill and sprints away from a ridiculously exaggerated explosion. With nowhere else to go, he jumps off the cliff, facing what should be certain death. Yet, at his last moments, he's saved by the vulture, which carries him back to Fortesque Cemetery. With the death of Zarok, the townsfolk have their souls restored and are no longer under Zarok's influence, free to return to their normal lives. The undead once again pass away and return their souls to the cemetery, where they can finally rest in peace. Daniel stands by the same mausoleum where the game starts. Satisfied with how far he's come and the people that he saved, he takes one last look at his mural, now imbued with the true meaning of what it means to be a hero. With a proud smile on his face, he lies back down for the last time as Gallowmere's true hero. However, if Dan has collected all the chalices, we get an extra scene, showing that he's finally rewarded with a place in the Hall of Heroes to be properly remembered for his now very real heroic accomplishments. We also get a scene with Dan and the other heroes celebrating his new herohood as the camera pans out and reveals Daniel's brand new constellation, bringing the game to an end. And that ends this episode of Story Explained. Let me know down in the comments what you thought and whether you liked this game as much as I did. Like I said in the beginning, this game is one of my favorites to play for Halloween because the aesthetic is just too perfect. It can be a little janky as far as the combat goes, but with the remake's polish on everything else, that's a small price to pay. My only issue with the MediEvil series is that the sequel never got remade, so if I tackle that eventually, it'll be a very different looking video. Also, thank you so much for the 250 views on the Suffering video. It might not sound like much, but it's still the most viewed video on my channel, and I'm happy to see that everyone enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and suggest some new games to cover in the comments, as I'll be making more videos in this series going forward. Thank you again so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Happy Halloween!